Hi, this is Pavan Sukhdev from Yale University. I'm here today with another Yale University professor, John Ander. John's a somewhat special person because his background is investment banking. He was earlier the head of global capital markets at Morgan Stanley and vice chair of their institutional securities group. He left them in 2007, and since then he has worked solely on his main area of passion and interest, which is energy and financing energy. And among other things, he's been representing to the Waxman-Markey Congressional Committee. Hi, John. Great to have you here today at Yale.
Great to be here.
It's so cool to be speaking with you, especially because we're both from the finance world and both from investment banks. And in some ways, I guess our paths and our careers have moved in parallel, me on the biodiversity financing side and you on the energy financing side. Tell me in a few words, what gave you this passion? What made you move in that direction?
Well, I think it really goes back to when I left business school in 1980. I really wanted to work on alternative energy.
Right.
And oil prices were very high and things were going to change, and that's really what I wanted to make my career. And so I worked in project finance, and by the mid-80s, there was no project finance for alternative energy.
Right.
And as, fast forward through a couple of decades with Morgan Stanley, and climate change coming, I felt like I wanted to be back involved with clean energy, something that I gave up on once, or the world gave up on,
right.
but we can't afford to give up on now.
Quite true. And that's pretty much what we are saying in this book and campaign called Corporation 2020. But we are a bit puzzled. We feel that the case has been made macroeconomically, sectorally, in every which way, that we should be addressing carbon pricing with priority, and yet right here in the US, we don't still have carbon pricing. What's your take on this?
Climate is an issue where if you look at where marginal costs and marginal benefits on some model meet and say that should be the price of carbon, people can come up with pretty low numbers for carbon and say, well, we can, maybe it's $10 a ton or we can put it off, but they don't really recognize the risk in that fat tail, which would imply much higher prices. So just to give you an example, when a dozen or so US government agencies signed off on the first social cost of carbon for the US, which will be used by EPA in its regulation of greenhouse gases, some people call the social cost of carbon the most important number you've never heard of. But what they said was $21 a ton. That's the social cost of carbon.
As against,
however, at the 95th percentile, meaning that fat tail I'm talking about, the number is 65.
Yeah.
So you pick your number.
Right.
So I think, just to answer your question, Pavan, I think that kind of nuance, if you will, needs to be explained to people, and they need to understand. And what I usually do to explain it is I say it's a lot like the financial crisis, where all those mortgages weren't going to go bad, and securities rated AAA would never be turned into single C.
Into dust.
But they did.
That's right, yes.
The difference being that in a financial crisis with all kinds of fat tail risks, you can pump money into the banks and correct it. With the climate system, you can't refreeze an ice sheet.
How can we move forward? Don't you feel that at the same time as the drive towards creating a carbon regime, there needs to be a drive towards improved information flow, disclosure of externalities?
Yeah, sure. But I believe we will get something done, and I think the thing that pushes this over the top will be the business community.
Right.
So yes, there are forces in the business community, whether it be fossil fuels or the Koch brothers and their information about how climate change isn't happening and all or disinformation. By and large, CEOs, their job is to make long-term investment decisions that provide good returns for their shareholders. You can't do that if, in the energy business, if you don't know whether it's going to be all about burning coal or we're going to go to decarbonized systems, whether that be renewables or nuclear or CCS or efficiency, what have you. And I think in the end, the business community will stand up and be the force that gets this over the line.
I mean, we have tilted this football field so heavily in favor of the brown economy against the green that no matter what your well-meaning and intelligent, forward-looking CEO says or feels, he's working against a tilt.
Well, Pavan, all I can say is let's look at the positive and try to accentuate that. Two things I would cite. Number one, the IEA and their World Energy Outlook last year hit the subsidy topic, square on.
Yes.
Full disclosure, every country, the nature of subsidies, some are subsidies like tax breaks, some are actually subsidies by keep the price of oil low and people use more.
Yeah.
But they hit it very hard. There's incredible transparency now on who's subsidizing what. I think that's a positive thing, and over time we have to have this World Energy Outlook spend even more time on subsidies, put more pressure on, and if there is a global treaty in 2015, that should be on the table. Another one I'd say is Simpson-Bowles. If you go back to the President's Commission on Reducing the Deficit,
Right.
the thing that Simpson-Bowles and other deficit commissions hit on very well is tax expenditures are the biggest problem. So maybe along with broadening the tax base, lowering rates, cutting out tax expenditures, well, what's the biggest tax expenditure out there? Fossil fuels. All I can say is, Pavan, I don't disagree with you at all, but let's try to build on a couple of positives that are out there.
I know that you've been on record on occasion in websites and stuff talking about upstream taxation. How would you frame that in a situation like in the US?
Well, I think, Pavan, it reminds me of a 4-hour debate on that subject that I participated in. My partner was Billy Pizer, now at Duke, formerly at Treasury. Right. We argued the cap side, the other group argued the tax side. And just to be really simple about it, in the economic literature, you tend to see more economists favoring taxes because they say that the benefits of policy are pretty flat. In other words, any extra ton of greenhouse gas you put up there doesn't change things that dramatically. Folks around uncertainty, say Martin Weitzman at Harvard, or I mentioned before using real options, say that's not really the right way to look at it because what's happening in the atmosphere is not linear, it's not normally distributed. We're prone to feedback effects like melting permafrost and ice and such that can trigger tipping points and things can move very rapidly. So I tend to favor a cap on emissions. That is the right answer for the environment. The problem with taxes is the cigarette problem, that you can tax cigarettes, but people still keep smoking. Now, eventually, you can raise the price to a point where people just won't smoke because it's too expensive. But that cigarette tax analogy is very relevant. So let's say we had a carbon price at the current ETS price. I think we'd see a lot of people pay that tax and not change their energy, not decarbonize their energy system. So I tend to favor a cap, but at this point, I really favor, I'm with the business community, which I think overwhelmingly, not by market cap, not by weight of Exxon versus weight of General Electric or Siemens, the business community would say, look, we want the certainty of a carbon price. That will allow us to make the strategic changes to decarbonize that are necessary.
But to be honest, if we don't control things upstream, in other words, if we don't start taxing where extraction is happening, and we're talking about just a few thousand locations from which oil and gas are drawn, what hope is there? Because at the end of the day, there's always the chance of some group, some country, some jurisdiction, some group of companies not being part of a global system.
Well, I think go back to a paper by an academic who was at Yale at the time, Robert Repetto. I think he wrote a paper in 2007 about upstream cap and trade and the benefits. And certainly when you talk about three places, the refinery gate, the wellhead, and the mine mouth, it's a pretty good way to go. And so, as I say to people casually who will tolerate me for a few minutes at dinner on the topic, what I say really quickly is, look, a Pigovian tax, taxing a bad thing, at an upstream level, so it's a simple tax. It's the base. We always talk about broadening bases and taxes. The base is very broad because you get all the CO2 from energy. Those three places is a very good thing. And what I say to my more conservative friends, I consider myself a right in the middle, a moderate, is that taxing carbon upstream and cutting taxes on income, on capital gains, on corporate taxes, pick your tax, cutting tax rates, is a very compelling story. It always has been. Tax the bad, cut taxes on the good.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that, because that's actually one of the key planks. We've suggested 4 planks of change. Resource taxation replacing profits taxation is one of them. And that's clearly something that you would support.
Well, I'm not sure that I would say that in that, you know, I want to get something done.
Right.
So I was very influenced by people like Fred Krupp at Environmental Defense, who was my boss for a time, and who said, you know, I don't want to just be right. I don't like the fight. I want to win.
Yes.
And so I'd say, yes, sure, taxing resources, it has a lot of merit, but I want something that can be done and done, you know,
quickly,
expediently.
Yes.
And so what I would say is, look, the U.S., for example, has this budget crisis right now. A lot of people on the right want lower tax rates.
Yes.
And a lot of people in the environmental area, the energy area, right to the CEOs, you know, want a certain long-term price on carbon. So let's make this part of the fiscal solving a fiscal problem, which is, look, you know, in order to cut tax rates, we need some revenue. Let's get it from carbon.
Now, what do you think? We are both from finance, and we know the role of leverage in the last 4 recessions. If you go as far back as even the Latin American debt crisis, it was leverage at a national level. We still haven't really been able to capture as an economy, as a set of financiers, the way in which leverage and its misuse and its abuse and its excessive use seeps into corporate culture and then seeks cheap ways out, as in, we are too big to fail. Can you or I or anyone in finance really think that we've got this system organized if we don't control leverage a bit more?
What you're referring to is the kind of creative destruction that an economy needs, a free market economy needs, so that winners are funded and losers have their funding pulled. So that's very important. On the other hand, I can't spend a lot of time on that right now because I see, say, renewable companies or efficiency companies who are, you know, really struggling to even stay alive. So to me, I would worry less about too big to fail, and I'd worry more about just price carbon.
What's your vision of this non-incumbent corporation 2020, as we would call it? What's your vision of the corporation of the future?
There are more CEOs who want to do the right thing than don't. So over time, I have to view that as a positive, even with a very challenged political process in the U.S. By any model, global emissions need to peak by 2020 in order to stay on the stability target signed up by everyone in the UN, including the U.S., of 450 parts per million and, depending on climate sensitivity, roughly 2 degrees centigrade increase from pre-industrial. But so 2020 global peak would mean U.S. peak is now.
Now, basically.
Now.
That's right, yes.
All the developed world. So I think that, I think we need, yes, carbon needs to be priced. Ideally, it would be with a firm cap on emissions at upstream, so we get everything and no deals, nobody's slipping through or cutting out. But if need be, a tax that goes into a cap, and probably just based on, you know, the politics of the situation in the U.S. and probably other places as well, cutting other taxes to by taxing carbon.
John, it's been a delight to speak with you. It's been worrying to hear about some of the things that you said, and of course we agree with the urgency. That was John Ander, who teaches at Yale University, has been an investment banker, is an expert on climate and energy, and talks to us about the sheer urgency that he sees for carbon pricing, which is no longer something to be dreamed about, but something to be achieved, in his opinion, now.